Egypt, 1954. Egyptian Jews Shmuel Azar and Moshe Marzouk are hanged, convicted of espionage and sabotage on behalf of a foreign nation, while their alleged accomplices are thrown in prison. The Israeli government condemns Egypt for what it calls vile anti-Semitism and begins plotting retaliation. What follows sets off a ripple effect, one that echoes all the way to today's conflict. But were these Egyptian Jews truly victims of anti-Semitic persecution, or did the convictions hold merit? Decades later, the answer became undeniable. In 2005, Israel officially acknowledged that the convicts were, in fact, operatives of the state, even presenting certificates of appreciation to the surviving agents. As for their original mission, it was meant to drive wedges between nations, but it ultimately led to something far more catastrophic.
First reaction from the Jews was one of joy. Crowds gathered in the streets and greeted the birth of their state with traditional dances. Arab opposition to the partition scheme has been violent. The call for a holy war against the Jews went out from Cairo. A 3-day general strike coincided with an intensive recruiting campaign.
Egypt was one of the 5 Arab countries that declared war on Israel following its establishment in 1948, a conflict known in Israel as the War of Independence, and to Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe. The Arab coalition failed to achieve its goal of destroying the new state, suffering large military losses and reputational damage due to poor battlefield performance. Egypt's only territorial gain during the war was the Gaza Strip, and despite the armistice, it refused to recognize Israel and maintained open hostility. At the time, Egypt was ruled by King Farouk, whose primary concern was holding on to power. Under his leadership, the country remained pro-Western and heavily influenced by British colonial interests. Britain maintained military control over the Suez Canal zone, a vital global trade route connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. This control was strategic and deeply symbolic, fueling Egyptian resentment over continued foreign dominance. In 1952, the Egyptian monarchy was overthrown in a coup led by the Free Officers Movement, bringing Jamal Abdel Nasser to power. Nasser was a charismatic and ambitious leader whose vision sharply contrasted with the old monarchy. His goals included ending foreign domination, implementing land reform, addressing social inequality, and restoring national dignity. Nasser also embraced pan-Arabism as a central policy, advocating for Arab unity against colonialism and Western influence. Yet Egypt's stance towards Israel remained unchanged, with the stated goal of eliminating the Jewish state. The new leadership worried Israel and its Western allies, particularly Britain. However, the United States did not resonate with Britain's troubles. As Secretary of State John Foster Dulles put it, Soviet encroachment in Egypt was a far greater concern to Washington than Britain's colonial position. Britain, though to a lesser extent, also shared the broader goal of keeping Nasser away from Soviet influence. To maintain leverage over Egypt, it joined the US in offering substantial financial aid for the construction of the High Dam at Aswan, a project Nasser viewed as a signature achievement of his presidency. There remained, however, 2 countries strongly opposed to Nasser's regime: France and Israel. Beyond their tensions over the Suez Canal, Nasser's support for Algerian rebels fighting for independence from French rule further strained relations. His uncompromising anti-colonial stance and opposition to the Jewish state ultimately made France and Israel natural allies. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was convinced that another war with Egypt was inevitable, and better triggered sooner than later. To prepare, he negotiated an arms deal with France, securing much-needed military equipment. However, within the French Foreign Ministry, there was significant opposition to deepening the partnership. Overcoming that resistance would require a powerful catalyst. Ironically, Israel provided that catalyst itself.
But nevertheless prepared to die at any time for Egypt. This remark sent his stock soaring even higher than before in his country's capital, and he is hailed as a hero on his return.
In 1954, Israel saw itself facing an existential threat. Jamal Abdel Nasser was seeking closer ties with the US, including a potential arms deal. While such an agreement would strengthen American influence in the region, US officials remained cautious due to Nasser's stated goal of destroying Israel. Meanwhile, tensions were rising in the Suez Canal zone. Egyptian attacks on British troops led Britain to seriously consider withdrawing from its strategic base. For Israel, this was deeply troubling. They viewed the British military presence as a critical deterrent against an Egyptian assault. Western powers had historically favored Middle Eastern leaders who could maintain stability, whether through popular support or authoritarian control. Israeli strategists reasoned that if Nasser's regime could be shown as vulnerable to internal chaos, the US and Britain might reconsider their support. From this logic emerged a risky plan within Israeli intelligence, a covert effort designed to sow instability in Egypt. This plan would ultimately be remembered as the Lavon Affair. In the aftermath of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israel had established sleeper cells in Egypt, small groups of Israeli loyalists trained in secret to act as a fifth column, capable of sabotage or terror attacks against Egypt in the event of war. Israeli intelligence found an opportunity to activate this network. The sleeper cells were ordered to carry out a false flag operation codenamed Operation Susannah. It consisted of a small number of Egyptian Jews who had received training in Israel and Egypt. The plan called for bombing Western institutions and buildings in Egypt, under the assumption that the attacks would be blamed on Egyptian dissidents such as the Muslim Brotherhood or the Communist Party. The Muslim Brotherhood in particular had grown increasingly hostile towards Nasser after he entered negotiations with the British over the Suez Canal base, seeing it as a betrayal of Egyptian sovereignty. This made them a very convenient target for blame. Israel's hope was that Operation Susannah would embolden Nasser's enemies and undermine Western support for his regime. Operational details, including recruitment, fell under the responsibility of military intelligence agent Avraham Seidenberg, better known as Avri Elad, who had a positive reputation for uncovering methods used by wanted Nazi war criminals to escape to Arab countries. And so the operation was carried out. It began on July 2nd, 1954, with bombs set off inside the Alexandria post office. On July 14th, incendiary devices were set off in US consulate libraries in Alexandria and Cairo. On July 23rd, bombs were set off in two cinemas, the railway terminal, and the central post office in Cairo. There were no casualties as the bombs were timed to detonate when no one was likely to be present. Their next bombing was planned for a movie theater in Cairo on July 27th. They had even stationed a fire truck outside the theater in anticipation. But as saboteur Philip Nathanson approached, his incendiary device detonated in his pocket. Strangely enough, the Egyptians were already prepared at the site. They arrested Nathanson and the other saboteurs on the spot. Under interrogation, the sleeper cell quickly unraveled. Elad and a few others managed to escape, but on October 5th, Egypt's interior minister announced the breakup of a 13-man Israeli sabotage network, a number that likely included Elad despite his escape. It remained unclear how the Egyptians were warned about the bombing, but Egyptian sources later confirmed in the magazine October that Elad had been working for both Israel and Egypt, suggesting that he was the one who compromised the operation. Among those arrested was Israeli intelligence agent Max Binet, who committed suicide upon arrest. One of the Egyptian Jews, Yosef Karman, committed suicide in prison. The remaining 10 prisoners were tried, 2 were acquitted, and all the others were convicted. The death penalty by hanging was announced and carried out for 2 conspirators, Shmuel Azar, an engineer, and Moshe Marzouk, a physician. The rest received prison sentences ranging from 7 years to life. but those still imprisoned in 1968 were released as part of a prison exchange following the 1967 Six-Day War. Elad settled abroad but was tricked into returning to Israel, where he was arrested and tried before a secret tribunal in 1959. He was not charged with being a double agent but was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for having illegal contact with Egyptian intelligence. The disastrous operation put the lives of 50,000 Jews living in Egypt at high risk. Yet not a single Israeli leader was prepared to accept responsibility for it. In fact, they were shocked at its failure. But why were they? From the beginning, the high risk was apparent. Firstly, it was uncertain if the desired outcome would materialize, and to what extent the West would actually lose confidence in Nasser's regime. Secondly, the operation's success depended heavily on creating the perception of Egypt's weak security. But if the West's confidence in Egypt was justified, the sleeper cell was much more likely to be discovered. Ultimately, Israel had not yet mastered the art of false flag operations, and Operation Susannah failed due to sheer hubris and a severe underestimation of Egypt's capabilities. Yet this was merely the beginning of the operation's consequences. The Lavon Affair would create a ripple effect that continues to stain the geopolitical atmosphere to this day. Intelligence agencies often operate without direct authorization from the government. This was ostensibly the case here. Israeli Prime Minister Moshe Sharet had been kept in the dark about the false flag operation. Yet, in the aftermath of the fallout, he chose to protect the interests of his own people rather than relieve himself of accountability. Sharet worked to preserve Israel's image as the victim in the Arab-Israeli conflict, portraying the Egyptian proceedings as a show trial of a group of Jews who became victims of false accusations of espionage, and who it seems are being threatened and tortured in order to extract from them confessions in imaginary crimes. The Israeli press and later the American press picked up on this theme, drawing comparisons between Nasser's Egypt and Nazi Germany. Pinhas Lavon, Israel's Minister of Defense, was accused of approving the sabotage campaign. He immediately denied the accusation. In 1955, the Prime Minister secretly ordered an investigation to determine who was responsible. Avri Elad's testimony produced a document bearing Lavon's signature, allegedly authorizing the operation. Although responsibility couldn't be conclusively pinned on him, Lavon officially oversaw such intelligence operations, giving the government justification to force his resignation in February. Later in 1960, new evidence emerged suggesting that documents had been forged to implicate Lavon. It was also concluded that Elad had given perjured testimony. This prompted another internal inquiry, which found that Lavon had not authorized the operation, and had likely been framed or scapegoated by senior military officers. Despite this, his name remained inextricably linked to the failed campaign. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion did not publicly clear Lavon's name. Instead, he chose to protect his protégés and the broader security establishment from the damaging accusation that military officers were conducting risky operations without proper civilian authorization. At the same time, the Israeli government maintained the public stance that the Egyptian Jewish conspirators were innocent victims of anti-Semitism. The narrative remained in place until March 1975, when the government allowed 3 of the operatives, Robert Tadassa, Victor Levy, and Marcelo Ninyoy, to appear on Israeli television and acknowledge their roles as saboteurs in Egypt. They confirmed they had acted on orders from Israel, effectively putting to rest the long-standing official denials.
Israel buries a victim of the fighting with Egypt along the Gaza Strip. The frontier clashes, with each side accusing the other of aggression, threaten to trigger an all-out Arab-Israeli war in the Middle East.
After Lavon's resignation, Ben-Gurion took over as defense minister and later resumed his position as prime minister. The Israeli public and news outlets were outraged over what they described as anti-Semitic show trials in Egypt, giving Ben-Gurion the public support he needed for a military incursion. In late February 1955, Israeli forces launched a sudden raid on the Gaza Strip. killing 39 Egyptian soldiers while sustaining no casualties themselves. The operation deeply embarrassed Jamal Abdel Nasser. It was a wake-up call. If Egypt was to stand up to Israel, it would need a stronger, modernized military. Nasser turned to the West for help, but the United States and Britain, which were wary of his anti-colonial stance and skeptical of his growing influence, refused to provide arms. With few options left, Nasser chose the path the West had long feared. He reached out to the Soviet Union. The Soviets responded indirectly, arranging for Egypt to acquire large quantities of weapons from Czechoslovakia. The 1955 Czech arms deal shifted the regional balance of power and marked the Soviet Union's first significant foothold in the Middle East. This move angered Washington. President Eisenhower viewed Nasser's growing ties with the Eastern Bloc and his recognition of Communist China as direct provocations. As a warning to others, the United States and Britain withdrew their funding from Egypt's Aswan High Dam project and pressured the World Bank to cancel a crucial loan. But Nasser did not back down. Instead, he broke off talks with the British and on July 26, 1956, stunned the world by nationalizing the Suez Canal. His plan was to use the canal's revenues to finance the Aswan Dam on Egypt's own terms, this time with Soviet support behind him. When efforts by Western countries to internationalize the canal failed at the United Nations, in part due to a Soviet veto, France began pushing for military intervention. A delegation was sent to London to persuade the British to join a coordinated operation. Prime Minister Anthony Eden was open to the idea, but insisted on a clear pretext to legitimize military action. The French came up with a proposal that Israel initiates the attack on Egypt by advancing through the Sinai Peninsula toward the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. And once the operation is underway, Britain and France, presenting themselves as neutral powers protecting international access to the canal, demand the withdrawal of both Israeli and Egyptian forces. The plan assumed Egypt would refuse, providing justification for British and French military intervention. In initial meetings, Israeli officials expressed interest in cooperating but hesitated to be the first to act. But at the time, David Ben-Gurion had become deeply influenced by the recent nuclear achievements of the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom, which made him obsessed with the idea of developing nuclear weapons, as he believed that nuclear deterrence was critical for Israel's long-term security in a hostile region. With that vision in mind, Israel changed its position and secured a deal with France. In exchange for agreeing to launch the initial attack on Egypt, France would supply a nuclear reactor, uranium, and supporting technology, laying the foundation for what would eventually become Israel's nuclear weapons program.
After weeks of stalemate, the Suez Crisis burst dramatically into the news again, for Israel has invaded Egypt. Britain and France have declared the canal in danger, and British and French troops are on the move.
On October 29, 1956, Israel launched Operation Kadesh, citing Egyptian border provocations and the threat of an imminent invasion as its casus belli. The British and French followed the plan, invading Egypt on November 5th and November 6th, the latter of which was Election Day in the United States. The invasion infuriated President Eisenhower, who believed it would open the door for Soviet involvement in Middle East affairs. The US responded by blocking Britain and France's access to IMF funds and threatening to withhold oil supplies. Additionally, the UN General Assembly, backed by US and Soviet resolutions, demanded a ceasefire and withdrawal. Both countries agreed to a ceasefire on November 7th and withdrew their troops by December. By then, Israel had advanced deep into Egyptian territory, capturing both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. President Eisenhower had to apply significant pressure to force Israel to withdraw, including threatening to suspend American aid and impose economic sanctions. Faced with these measures, Israel capitulated and completed its withdrawal by March 1957. Despite the campaign's failure, France was compelled to honor its part of the Israeli-French agreement. This led to the construction in 1958 of a large research reactor and reprocessing facility at Dimona, which became and remains the center of Israel's nuclear weapons development. By 1958 to 1959, US intelligence began detecting unusual construction activity in Israel's Negev desert. High altitude U-2 spy plane overflights confirmed the development of a large facility near Dimona, which Israeli officials described as a peaceful research reactor. However, CIA reports, including a December 1960 State Department memo, raised serious doubts, suggesting the site would be part of a nuclear weapons program. The Eisenhower administration was strongly committed to global nuclear non-proliferation. So in 1960, Washington formally requested clarification, prompting Prime Minister Ben-Gurion to publicly state in December that the facility was for peaceful purposes only. Despite this assurance, US officials remained unconvinced, and this skepticism carried over into the Kennedy administration. When John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, he faced growing concerns about regional instability and the risk of an arms race in the Middle East. Determined to prevent nuclear proliferation, he adopted a firmer approach and pressed Israel directly to allow inspections at Dimona to confirm its peaceful purpose. At first, Israel rejected the idea of inspections outright. Even after agreeing in principle, they repeatedly delayed an actual visit. It wasn't until May that a US inspection team was finally allowed on site. They reported that Dimona lacked key facilities that would indicate a weapons program, such as plutonium reprocessing. Still, US officials insisted on regular inspections to reassure Arab neighbors that Israel wasn't secretly developing a bomb. After that initial visit, Israel managed to avoid further inspections for a time. In late 1962, during a meeting with President Kennedy, Israeli Foreign Minister Golda Meir insisted that Israel was not on a path to develop nuclear weapons. However, in early 1963, Kennedy received a new national intelligence estimate, warning that the Dimona complex was likely to become operational later that year. Once running, it could enable Israel to produce enough plutonium for 1 or 2 nuclear weapons annually. A few weeks later, in mid-March, Sherman Kent, director of the Office of National Estimates, signed off on an intelligence assessment outlining the regional and global implications if Israel acquired nuclear weapons. Concerned by these findings, Kennedy issued National Security Action Memorandum 231, a formal directive instructing the State Department, Defense Department, and CIA to study Middle Eastern nuclear capabilities and their potential consequences. By early April, the President and his advisor turned their concerns about Dimona into a clear policy stance. They quietly but firmly insisted that Israel allow regular biannual US inspections of the facility. Ben-Gurion was not prepared to accept these terms outright, but neither was he willing to completely reject them. Instead, he tried to divert Kennedy's focus away from non-proliferation and towards Israel's security challenges. He invoked the fear of another Holocaust, pointing to the Arab Federation proclamation signed by Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, which called for a military union aimed at the liberation of Palestine. This rhetoric was not new, and it remained unclear whether Ben-Gurion genuinely saw the proclamation as an existential threat, but it served as a last resort to avoid further inspections on the nuclear program. Kennedy did not budge on Dimona. He dismissed Ben-Gurion's concerns and insisted that the real danger to the region was the introduction of advanced offensive systems. The president grew increasingly frustrated, feeling that Ben-Gurion was disrespecting him. On May 18th, Kennedy sent Ben-Gurion a private letter, firmly urging regular biannual US inspections of the Dimona nuclear facility. He warned that the US government's commitment and support for Israel could be seriously jeopardized if it was unable to obtain reliable information about Israel's nuclear activities. Ben-Gurion did not reply to the letter. On June 15th, Kennedy sent a follow-up letter, repeating the same threat. Just one day later, on June 16th, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's George Washington, resigned from office for a reason never disclosed. It is alleged that he never read the letter. Still, the claim is quite dubious.
18 years ago, the event of nuclear weapons changed the course of the world, as well as the war. Since that time, all mankind has been struggling to escape from the darkening prospect of mass destruction on Earth.
On July 5th, less than 10 days after Levi Eshkol became Israel's prime minister, Kennedy sent him a 3-page letter, nearly identical to the one he had sent Ben-Gurion. Eshkol was surprised by the president's tough demands. Not since the Suez Crisis had an American president been so blunt with an Israeli prime minister. His initial response was to ask for more time for consultations. It wasn't until August 19, 1963, more than 6 weeks later, that Eshkol finally issued a response. While framed as cooperative, his reply was non-committal and vague. Under Kennedy's sustained diplomatic pressure, Eshkol reluctantly agreed in principle to allow US scientists to visit Dimona. But he avoided setting a clear timeline and refused to commit to the biannual inspections the US had requested. As the Dimona nuclear complex neared full operational status, Israeli leaders became increasingly concerned about the consequences of continued US scrutiny. It had become clear that President Kennedy would likely demand the dismantling of Israel's nuclear program if he concluded it was being used to develop nuclear weapons. Yet at the same time, declassified intelligence records suggest that Israel may have been receiving covert support from within the American intelligence community, in direct contrast to Kennedy's firm stance against nuclear proliferation. In the 1950s, James Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence chief, developed a close relationship with Israeli intelligence services, including Mossad and Shin Bet. This partnership played a role in one of the Cold War's most significant intelligence exchanges. The acquisition of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin, reportedly obtained by Mossad through a Polish Jewish journalist and later shared with the CIA. In return, Israel sought US intelligence on its Arab neighbors. But JFK-era documents declassified by the Trump administration in March 2025 suggest this relationship may have gone further than previously believed. James Angleton's 1975 Church Committee testimony revealed that Angleton fostered a covert intelligence sharing agreement with Israel, enabling discreet cooperation that likely shielded Israel's nuclear program from US scrutiny. Additionally, the testimony discloses allegations that Angleton facilitated Israel's acquisition of atomic technology, which indirectly supported the Dimona reactor's plutonium production and the suspected diversion of highly enriched uranium. These revelations raise a troubling question. While President Kennedy was relentlessly pressuring Israel to abandon its nuclear ambitions, was a trusted CIA official quietly clearing the path for them? A confrontation was inevitable. The walls were closing in. But before the reckoning could arrive for the Israelis and their accomplices, fate intervened. On November 22, 1963, tragedy struck in downtown Dallas.